to another section of AWS On Air at the Washington, D.C. Summit. We are live today for day 2. I'm Kyle Dickinson, your neighborhood-friendly senior security solution architect that specializes in threat detection and incident response. This is my friend, Jeff.
My name is Jeff Mershak, and I'm a senior solutions architect with our DoD Air Force team. Also help my customers in a dynamic regulatory environment, and that's what we're going to talk about here. So Nivas, go ahead and introduce yourself. Nivas is a host himself, but today, right now,
he's on the other side.
He's on the other side of the table. So tell us about yourself.
Thanks, guys. So hi, everyone. My name is Nivas. I'm a cloud governance specialist, so I help our customers with our governance services here at AWS. David?
My name is David. I'm a product manager for Control Tower. My primary focus is around governance and compliance.
More Control Tower, love it. Awesome. We just talked about Control Tower just last section.
I heard, and it was a great session on the multi-account strategy as well, figuring out how to create your organizational units.
Now, when you're saying governance, what does that even mean? Like a dynamic regulatory environment? That sounds very important.
Sure. First of all, we'll talk about governance, and typically it just talks about or refers to rules, processes, mechanisms, and maybe even the reporting, but everything aligns with the business objectives of your organization. So your organization is trying to meet regulatory and compliance requirements. That's part of governance, reducing risk, managing security.
So a good example of that, a lot of companies that handle credit card information, they have to adhere to the PCI regulatory requirements. So that's a very common one.
That's right.
Yeah. So with that comes a bunch of controls or requirements that you have to prove that your IT systems are meeting. So.
Yeah, and then I think where we come in there is Control Tower, and we can get into a demo a little bit later. But we organize those controls based on frameworks, but also control objectives and by services as well. So they're really easy to find and sort of improve your governance posture.
Yeah, so I brought up PCI. What are some others that come to the top of mind? I guess like HIPAA is the other one that comes up. We're at the DC Summit, the Public Sector Summit, so FedRAMP, that's a big one.
You're right, there's many. There's NIST, the CIS.
There's so many.
There's so many. And here's the thing about regulatory and security frameworks. We're operating in a global world. There's many different industries.
Yes. Right.
We should expect to find many more increasing, as well as the policies changing. And so for this to do this properly, you need to have a IT environment, a cloud environment that can be adaptable, as well as change.
And Control Tower is helping enable that.
That's right.
Absolutely. And so I think another thing that happens there is that there's lots of overlap between those frameworks. And how do you find that overlap? Control Tower can help you do that.
How so?
Well, when we organize our controls, like I said, you can see it through the framework lens. You can also see it through a control objective lens, which I think is where that overlap is. So say, for example, in frameworks, you want to ensure encryption at rest, encryption in transit. I think pretty much every framework has that set of controls around there. Well, so how do you find all the controls that apply to that? We can organize them in that sense.
I believe even like the controls that Control Tower applies, you could even drill down into that control and it'll map it to a framework, right?
That's right.
Awesome. Will you be showing us that later in the moment?
That's right, yes.
Yeah. So let's say I'm an enterprise, I'm launching an application that has like OpenSearch or something like SageMaker. I want to ensure that there are certain options of those services configured. How is Control Tower going to help me with that?
Well, I think we know that customers, particularly in highly regulated industries, need a way to figure out what is the best coverage model for security and compliance to allow their developers to use AWS services and innovate at scale. So really, that work entails understanding which controls apply to which frameworks, and then how do you actually achieve those both in terms of technical respects, but also in terms of compliance and security standards. So the controls that we implement, like I mentioned before, are both framework-based as well as control objective as well. So it's really easy, and services. So it's really easy to find those controls that apply to that framework, but that service as well.
Yeah, and I should also add, we have the proactive controls, and these proactive controls are based on templates, so they're going to ensure that non-compliant resources are not launched by the developers.
Okay. Yeah, so prevent it from even becoming a non-compliant thing by preventing the non-compliant thing from even spinning up.
And then even to go a step forward, we have a set of proactive controls, which are a little bit different from preventive. And Navas kind of hinted this already, where preventive controls are those optional controls implemented through a technology called CloudFormation hooks. And what they actually do is that these controls check the resources before they're deployed, and they can proactively prevent them from deploying if they're non-compliant.
Right. So for example, if you had a requirement that all S3 buckets had to have encryption, and if you deployed a CloudFormation template that said, hey, here's an unencrypted S3 bucket, that those hooks would see that and prevent that from even being deployed.
That's right. And it goes back to your question. Now, if developers are launching SageMaker and OpenSearch instances with the proactive controls that are a part of Control Tower, it's going to ensure that the instances are properly configured. It'll have encryption as well as whatever else is required from the organization's perspective.
That's cool. I call that preventing the milk from being spilled.
Exactly.
and so you're going to show us, so we have the categories of controls here. Could you show us an example of a proactive control or how we would implement a proactive control?
Yeah, so let's actually go to the demo. We can actually see it live here. So I'll actually start really at the dashboard for Control Tower. And then if you look on the left-hand pane here, there's a particular section called Controls Library. And within the Controls Library, there are categories and then a list of all controls. So if you look at the categories, you're going to start to see that sort of breakdown of what we were talking about before. Yep. We have control objectives, which we think are sort of like that translation layer between the control and the framework. So you have things like establishing logging and monitoring, encrypting data at rest, using strong authentication. Yep. You can also organize these by framework. So say, for example, we look at PCI DSS, you're going to see that list of controls. And then what we can do is actually look by services. So let's go with that example that we talked about before. Navas sort of hinted at, what if my developers want to use SageMaker? Yep. How do I know I can use SageMaker in a safe and compliant way? You can look for the services here, and you see we have 39 services covered. And those are organized by service names. You can search for service, which is service equals SageMaker here, and see all of the control objectives that are covered and all of the controls that are within or covering SageMaker.
So is this based on what frameworks? I saw there were only 3 frameworks there. Can you load more control objectives? I mean, there's more than 39 AWS services. So I think some people would see that and be like, wait, what about all the others?
Great question. So our goal would be to cover as many as possible in breadth and in depth. So we start with the first set of services that are most used by developers or by our customers, and want to make sure those are covered first. So you've got your DynamoDB, you've got your S3 and things like that. So eventually we'll have additional coverage for this, but these are your core services that are covered here.
Perfect.
So if I want to dive in to the SageMaker controls, we get a table here that outlines, again, the service that it covers, the name of the control objective that's applying to that particular control, and then things like implementation. But I think for our demo purposes here, what I want to look at are the behaviors here. So we've got detective controls and proactive controls. So I want to dive into a proactive control since we've already sort of talked about that. So let me look at this particular control, which is CT SageMaker.pr.1. That's a mouthful there. I'll cover like what that actually means. I'll go through kind of like the details here of that control. So looking at the taxonomy of the control ID there, essentially what's saying is that this is a control tower control. SageMaker is the service that it covers. PR stands for proactive control. And the 1 means it's the first control or the number 1 control, not in priority order, but the first control that we developed for SageMaker here.
So that's probably important to distinguish that. This isn't necessarily saying this is like the number 1 control to implement, but this is just the first control that was released for the SageMaker service.
That's right.
Okay.
And then if I could go back to sort of like, well, how does this map to control objectives? How does this map to other frameworks? It's all listed here in the metadata. So you get, it maps to frameworks NIST and PCI, and then you can also see the control IDs.
Yeah. That's going to save a lot of time for a lot of people, so that's awesome.
Because I think one of the common themes is they'll look at a framework and say, okay, what maps to this in this framework. And well, now it's being called out. So it's just like, here you go.
And typically how customers do that today, or we see a lot, are that they track these in Excel spreadsheets. And it's very difficult to manually go through and see how these apply.
That is not fun.
No, not fun. So this is the control, and I'll take you through a few more sort of details here about what this means. In the About section here, we talk about what the control actually does. That's super important. There's some other information here about what OUs it's enabled on. You can see I've already enabled this on a particular OU, what accounts it's enabled on. I think most important for us are the artifacts that are available here. So you have to think about the end customer for these controls.
Yep.
Who are using these controls? They're developers, they're ML scientists, they're not necessarily cloud architects. They run into, hey, you know, how do I know I'm using SageMaker properly? Or how do I know what my limitations are in using SageMaker? It's kind of outlined here in these artifacts.
And I think it's also worth mentioning that when you're implementing these proactive controls, do it on a test OU first, not your production OU.
That's
so
right.
you don't have any negative downstream impact.
That's right.
But this, I like that we have the like it's a bundled control.
Correct.
It's not just like, oh yeah, here's a thing that you enabled. What does it do? Well, here's the artifacts, here's the frameworks, here's the details of what it is.
That's right. We're trying to be very transparent with how these rules came together, and you can actually see what the rule consists of.
So I'll look into the guard rule, or what you might hear in certain circles called a gherkin. It's basically just the syntax of the control. And the most important thing to call out here are the scenarios. So we're actually giving developers or end users here the skip, fail, or pass scenarios so they know how to actually implement this and make it a compliant resource. So that is the gherkin. And then we also have sample templates of what is a non-compliant resource and what is a compliant resource. So again, developers can go through and test and see what the different outcomes are.
So, you know, I see something interesting on the screen I wanted to ask you about. I see AWS Marketplace for Control Tower on the side. Does that mean that maybe there are third parties that are publishing controls that you can use? Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Ross, you want to take that for?
Sure, yeah. And actually you can click through to it, and you can see that Control Tower has a number of third-party products that are very well integrated with Control Tower. Security tools, networking tools, developer operation tools. Everything works within a Control Tower environment. And yes, you can find
cool.
extra stuff that makes your cloud foundational environment more secure and just built to your needs.
Yeah, and I can imagine partners with third-party products saying, here's our product, but it also ties in the Control Tower to help you even more. So I just noticed that. Sorry, I thought that would be really cool to show off. So
you showed us that proactive control, but how does a customer know that they have the right controls enabled? And then how can they kind of prove that they have the right controls enabled?
So I'll take the first part of us if you want to take the second part.
Sure.
So how do you know you have the right controls enabled? Well, I think you always have to go back to what do you want to achieve with these controls. So first it's the control objective, and then second it's does it map to a particular framework. So this is just one example of a control, but if I look at the NIST framework, there are over 375 controls. So there's ways you can implement those controls programmatically. So if you want to make sure that you have the right controls for NIST 800, you would have to use all 370 plus controls. And then you want to talk about the audit feature a little bit?
Sure, yeah. Well, first of all, it's always test, right?
Yeah.
But you see the controls, and David just shared with us the proactive controls. You get the artifacts. You get both positive and negative test cases, so you can validate the controls like that. Now, if you want to ensure that you're meeting all of your audit and compliance requirements, like we have Audit Manager that also helps you assess your environment through reports. And so you can run that on an automated schedule.
Oh, that is really neat. Now, we have a few seconds left. Where can customers get started with learning more?
Oh, sure. Yeah, of course. So we have a Control Tower workshop that guides you through setting up Control Tower, as well as a workshop and a set of labs that are just based on controls. And it'll walk you through not just proactive controls, But preventative controls, your service control policies, your detective rules, config rules, as well as an integration with Security Hub.
Awesome.
And then one last plug in the last few seconds. If you're in context, you're in Control Tower, you always have the side panel if you want to know how to get started and what to use and what these definitions are. Always look at the side panel in the info bar within Control Tower.
Looks
Awesome.
great.
Thank you so much. Hey, everyone, stay tuned for awesome content here from the Washington, D.C. AWS Summit. Someone audit Nick's on button.